Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, YouTube, and welcome back to my history channel. I'd like to first apologise for my time that I've taken away. I wanted a couple of weeks before I do some recharging of my batteries, getting back to what I was doing, had to sort out some personal issues, blah, 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 boring stuff. I believe I left you at the administrations of the early Umayyads. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start making these slightly smaller. I'm going to make these 10-minute criteriations so that they're more swallowable for people to watch and break them up for each people individually. So, without further ado, the region of Abdul al-Rahim saw the further development of the court administration at Cordoba under the influence of the Eastern Islamic model. Despite political differences, the administration and cultural examples set by Baghdad were eagerly adopted. The most important administration function was the raising and paying of an army. In the Abbasid Caliphate, there was a steady move away from the large armies of part-time Arab soldiers, which had characterized the early Islamic State, to reliance on much smaller groups of mostly Turkish professional soldiers, a process largely completed in the reign of Abdul al-Rashid, contemporary al-Mu'tammid 833-42. It is not surprising to find evidence of a similar development in the Al-Andalusians in the first century of the Umayyad rule, and the move from reliance on the Duads, essentially unpaid part-timers, to the professional army recruits from outsiders is the main feature of the state formation of this time. This is where they're moving away from their part-time soldiers who were landowners, in similarity to the Christian world where your knights would go home, run their baronies or their baronets, and then come back to basically do soldiering work, or basically. So the Duads were closer to what the more than knightly time periods, relatively speaking. Abdul al-Rashid I is said to have formed a Shura security police, forming his Malway, the Umayyads, and some leading Bedouin families. Al-Qaman had certainly had a guard of professional soldiers. An intervening passage, the Akbir al-Majid, explains why this is so highly valued. News reached him, Al-Hakim, one day whilst he was in the park with some horsemen from his entourage, disporting themselves with their mounts, that Jalbil ibn al-Lahid was laying siege to June. Al-Hakim had 2,000 cavalry quartered on the bank of the river opposing the palace, grouped in two barracks, each of which housed 10 Afris. Every Afri was in charge of 100 horsemen, who then supervised, supplied and changed those who needed to be replaced, so that the forces would be ready to deal with any emergency which emerged. Rise, and it was as if they had a single mind. The Emir summoned one of the Afrids, and when he appeared before him, he secretly ordered him to set out for Jean against Ibn Laban immediately with his men, and not to tell anyone where he was going. Then he returned to his pleasures. An hour later he summoned another of his Afrids and gave him the same orders, and went on until he had summoned 10, and then all followed each other, none of them knowing the intentions of his fellow, until they fell upon Ibn al-Laid on the second day, continuously from morning until night. When the enemy saw this, they were aghast, and thought that they were surrounded by them, and that the region of the country had combined against them. They turned and fled immediately. The cavalry overran them, attacking their camps, and returned with the heads of them the third day. Al-Hakim was still with his Maui in the park, and none of them knew anything of the matter until he told them. No doubt that this is an idealized picture of a system which did not always work so well. And I have to agree with the critique here. That particular statement is more poetic. It has a poetical position. It's not known if it's historically provable. But, and I critique this quite clearly, the idea of the system at its time period would have been mildly terrifying towards those who attacked south involving the Christian non-believers. Alhamdulillah. No doubt this is an idealistical picture of the system which did not always work so well in practice, and is intended to demonstrate the power of the ruler, but it shows clearly the advantage of such a full-time professional force stationed in the capital. This small force of cavalry was vastly superior to irregulars of the Junads, who took time to assemble and often had political agendas of their own. There is little evidence in this political agenda. I mean, if you've seen any of my previous videos, you will know that this political agenda was a serious problem. There is little evidence about the working of the Jewish system in the Umayyad period. It did work. We have some more commentatable history towards it, but it was the auxiliaries. It was like how we in Britain would use the territorial army. The Jeweds were basically the reserves of the early Umayyads. There is little evidence about the workings of the Jewed system in the Umayyad period. The only account we have is a report from Ahmed al-Razid. There are other reports from al-Razid as well, who explains that the Syrian Jeweds, whose names were recorded in the Diwan, were divided into two groups, one which went on campaign and the others which stayed at home. After 3 months, the two groups would change places. Those on campaign were paid a riska of 5 dinars at the end of the campaign, whilst the chiefs received 200. The Baladas had no dimwa, and only their leaders were paid 100 dinars. The Syrians were exempt from the Usha tithe and only had to pay a share of the revenues they collected from their non-Muslims. The Balades, by contrast, were obliged to pay this tithe. When and how far this system worked in practice is doubtful. Now, we know that it went through the 1st century of Umayyad rule-ish. We're not entirely sure when it stopped after the 1st century of Umayyad rule. Certainly, it was looked at the names of the commanders of armies. We find very few Syrians or Baladari Arab names among them. Abu Shamaziria al-Jumiria, the Yemen leader, seemed to have been the only Arab military commanders employed by Abdul al-Rahim, and if the Jutes had been used, they would certainly have been commanded by their own leaders. Instead, we find Malwa like Abdul al-Karim and Maghrib and Isa bin Shahid, and a eunuch Nasir, who is said to have come from a Malwiran family in Cameroon, and Mohammed B. Rustid, a North African Persian origin but long settled in Bebian country, as the principal generals. The origins of these leaders probably reflect the origins of the troops they commanded. In the procedures of the process of state building, part-time tribal levies were phased out and replaced by professionals, mostly recruited from outside Andalusia, and known by the Arabs as al-Quras, the silent ones, from their inability to speak Arabic. This was a tradition in the early Arabic world of recruiting soldiers who weren't Arabic, hence why in many ways they had Christian slave soldiers. Historically, this was considered perfectly acceptable because it means they wouldn't be overly interfering in Muslim religious or political affairs. A process which would determine the characters of the later Umayyad states and account for much of its strength and weakness. The question of the collection of taxes is equally obscure. Under Abdul al-Rashid II, we find a mention of treasuries, Kuzarin, though they probably looked after rather than collected the money. Abdul al-Rashid II sent out one of his Fatas pages from Cordoba to supervise the collection of the fifth after the sack of the Baltic Islands, and the Emir's fief may have continued to be a significant source of windfall income. We have some details about the actual sums collected under Al-Hakim. The districts around Cordoba paid 142,000 dinars, made up of payments to the excluded military service, general taxes, and payments for the rights of falconry, Al-Hashid Nab al-Tariq and Nabal al-Bazir, as well as 53,000 moods of wheat and 73,000 moods of barley. Figures are given for an area: 35,000 dinars from Seville, 50,000 from Siona, 21,000 from Moron, and 15,000 from Nebrian. Now, this is the first examples of tax given by the Umayyads and in their time period, which, if you know anything about how the Umayyads work, this is not an unusual point of view to be standing by. They would spend most of their time maintaining their tax system, and they were still learning, critically building a tax system in general. And much of the advancement of their actual civic system didn't come in until the 10th century. So, I mean, at this point, we're still in the early to mid 9th century. So we're waiting pretty much for another century or there so before the actual proper Umayyad tax system comes in. But that's my first 10 minutes. I'm going to shorten these. I'm probably going to do a second one later on today as well, so I can do 2 10-minute patches through them and thereby move on. I do also intend to make myself criticably I'm going to start my Ottomans historical page as well today, so that I can get. I'm going to probably get 3 videos through, just to make sure that I've got all my stuff ready and set up. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope it has been more entertaining to be able to see it in smaller bites. Assalamu alaikum, and I wish you and your family and all your people peace.